So he got only up to, the bottom of Nun Aleph Amud Aleph, 4 lines from the bottom, one Amud behind, but we'll catch up pretty quickly. So says the Gemara at the 2 dots. Amar Rabbi Elazar, sorry. Minayin l'shochet behemah the markulis shu chayev. Right, the markulis is, we've talked about this idol a lot. They generally worship it by throwing stones at it. What if you do a different avodah, right? And we talked a lot about this yesterday. Different service, including slaughtering an animal, which is one of the universal ways to serve a god or an idol. If you do that to markulis, which normally is not practiced in that way, how do you know that you're chayev for avodat zarah? Nemar, because the pasuk says, you should no longer slaughter your animals l'si'irim, to the foreign gods. Now, this is in the reference to the psukim about shchutei chutz, about shechting outside of the Beit HaMikdash. Says Gemara, now it clearly does not apply to regular avodah of that god, meaning you're doing it the way normal people, it's normally worshipped. How do I know that? Because there's another verse, which we're going to have soon in Dvarim, of Eicha Yavdu Goyim Elat Elohim. Right? It says in Re'eh, don't say, how do the Goyim do their worship? Let me do it also. So you already know you can't do it the way they do it. So this must be referring to Taneo Inyan L'Shalo Kedarka. It must be referring to where you're doing it in a way that's not the normal way that this god, this idol, was worshipped. Says Gemara, well, that seems like a nice pasuk, but is this really the point of that pasuk? There's a whole other braita that analyzes this pasuk, and that braita on the top of Daf Nun Aleph Amud Bet says the following: Ad kan, meaning up till here in the parsha of Shchutei Chutz, hu medaber bekachim shikdisham b'shat isur habamot. We're referring to an animal that you said you separated as hektish. I'm going to bring this as a sacrifice during the time when bamot were prohibited. Remember that there were times in Jewish history when they did not have a strong central Beit HaMikdash, and everyone was entitled to sacrifice a korban in their backyard, right? Once there was a Beit HaMikdash, it became prohibited to bring animals anywhere but the Beit HaMikdash. And there's a lot of debate which we've had about whether that ended when the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, whether it doesn't end. But it says the Gemara, we're at the top of Daf Nun Aleph Amud Bet, Amud behind, but that's what he got up to, everyone. So we ad kan hu medaber kachim shekdisham b'shat isur habano. The pasuk is talking about animals that you made hektish when the bamot were prohibited, meaning when there was a Beit HaMikdash, and you hikrivam b'shat isur habamot. You brought them as a sacrifice during that time. That's prohibited. Shari onshan amor. The Torah says if you don't do it, if you don't bring them to the Beit HaMikdash, you're going to get killed, right? Petach ol moed lo havio, then you get karet. The Torah says that. Onesh shamanu. Now, so I know that you get karet if you do this. Azhara minayin. Where does the Torah say don't do it? Remember, the Torah always has to say don't do it, and if you do it, you get this consequence. Talmud Lomar. So it's based on the pasuk in Devarim of pen ta'aleh olotecha. You bring up your olah, and we have the famous statement of Reb Avin, Amar Reb Avin, Amar Reb Ila, Amar Reb Avin, Amar Reb Ila, Kol makom shenemar, the words he shamer, don't do, be careful, pen vi'al, those 3 words individually, enu ela lo taseh, they're all saying don't do that thing, right? So when it says pen, lest you do that, it means don't do it. It's a lo taseh. So that is if the animal was dedicated and sacrificed bishat isur habamot. But what about mikan ve'elach, says the Braita, from here on in the parsha, in the Torah, is referring to hu medaber b'kachim shekdishan bishat heter habamot. You set aside this animal when there was no Beit HaMikdash, when it was permitted to bring an animal on a personal bama, but then they built the Beit HaMikdash, or they built the Mishkan, depending on the case. Hikrivan bishat isur habamot. And then the Beit HaMikdash was built. That pre-existing animal is prohibited to be brought in your personal bama. Shenemar, that's what it's referring to when it says, Leman asher yaviu b'nei Yisrael zivchehem asher heim zovchim, meaning, asher heim zovchim, yeah. The ones that are hitarti l'chakfar, the animals that I previously said are fine for you to do, but now the reality changed, right? If you bring them al pnei hasadeh, you get punished. Milamed, that teaches you, shekol hazoveach bibama, if you sacrifice an animal on a private altar, bishat isur habamot, when the bama is prohibited because there's a Beit HaMikdash or a Mishkan, it's as if you brought it on the field, meaning you brought it not to God. The hivium lahashem, then it says, and bring it to God. That's a mitzvat aseh, right? That's a mitzvat aseh. meaning a positive commandment, bring your animal to God. Mitzvat lo taseh minayin, where's the negative? Don't do it outside. Talmud Lomar, that we learn from this pasuk that we just wanted to quote for telling you that you can't bring an animal to the Markulas. This Braita says, V'lo yisbechu od et sifreihem, right? That you can't, the commandment, don't slaughter your animal, means don't slaughter an animal on your private bama that should go to the Beit HaMikdash. We just said that this pasuk is there to tell you that you can't slaughter an animal to an Avodah Zarah, even if that's not the way you normally sacrifice to it. So anyways, that's the question. But before we answer the question, let's finish the Braita. The Braita ends by saying, we're on the first wide line on Daf Nun Aleph Amud Bet, Yachol Yehei Anush Karet. You might think you get Karet for that too, like you get for regular Shchutei Chutz. Talmud Lomar, therefore it says, Chukat Olam Tiel Zot Lahem. This will be a rule for you, Zot Lahem V'lo Acheret Lahem, meaning only this one gets Karet, only if you dedicated the animal and sacrificed the animal after the bamot were prohibited. So anyways, the question from the Braita, though, is that the Braita is using the pasuk of Lo Yizbechu Od Et Sifreihem to tell you that you can't slaughter an animal on a private bama. And we just said we needed to tell you that you can't bring an animal as a sacrifice to Markulis, to an idol. Amar Rava, says Rava, well, we can learn two things from the pasuk. Karibe, you can read it, Lo Yizbechu, right? The lo goes on don't slaughter it. And Karibe also read the lo on the word ve'od, meaning don't also do this. This is an additional detail of shchutei chutz. So basically, we can learn two lo tases from the pasuk because the word od and the word ziv yizbechu are each extra. So that is that halacha. Now continues the Mishnah now, third wide line. Let's say you find an idol and matzah berosho ma'ot ksut o kelim. Is that the words? Yeah. You find money, you find clothing, or you find kelim. Kelim are like, vessels, but like a chair or a box or something like that, right? Around the head of this Avodah Zarah, which we're talking about is Markulis from the previous Mishnah, Mercury, right? So says the Mishnah, mutarim. You can use the money, you can use the clothing. It's not considered to be something that was sacrificed for Avodah Zarah, because that's normally what people do. People don't bring that to Avodah Zarah. But if you have parchilei anavim, which are like branches of grapes, atarot shel shibolim, or wreaths of grain, or yenot, wine, shmanim, oil, and salatot. Shmanim is oil. Salatot is flour. The chol tavar shekiyotzi b'kreiv al gabe mizbeach. Any kind of vegetable or food that was brought to the mizbeach, asur. You have to assume that this was brought as a gift to the god, and therefore it's prohibited. Says the Gemara, now how do you know that? Remember, it's not that they worshipped the grapes. They brought the grapes as a gift. So Menani Mili, how do you know that bringing certain things is prohibited and certain things like money, ksut, kelim, and whatever the third one was, ma'ot, are permitted? How do you know that? Amar Chir bar Yosef Amar Bushaya, because look, the psukim are contradictory. Katuv Echad Omer, one verse says, you will see their shikutzehem. I don't know how to translate all these words. The things that are disgusting or prohibited, and giluleihem, which means they're avodah zarah, they're idols. Eitz ve'even, kesef v'zav asher imahem, right? The stones, the wood, the silver, and the gold, right? That is one pasuk. The katuv echad omer, but a separate pasuk, and meaning and you should not take it, basically. The katuv echad omer, but another pasuk says lo tachmod kesef v'zav alehem. Another pasuk only says kesef v'zav. So first pasuk said eitz ve'even, wood and stones, which we're thinking means like boxes and clothing and things like that. And the second pasuk only said money, right? Kesef v'zav alehem. Haketzad. How do you reconcile one pasuk which says eitz ve'even and one which says and kesef v'zav, and one which says only kesef v'zav? So the way you explain the psukim is that imahem dumya alehem. Remember, one verse said with them, and one said on them. So what it's teaching you is that it's only prohibited when you find it with them if it's similar to something that is on them. Meaning, ma'alehem, just like on top of an idol, only davar shel noi asur. Only something that's there to enhance the beauty of the idol would become asur. She'enu shel noi mutar. If they put something on the idol that was not meant to beautify the idol, it wouldn't be prohibited as part of the idol. So af imahem. So too, when you talk about imahem, which means what is brought to them, meaning what sacrifices you brought. It's only davar shonoi asur, only something that enhances the quality of the avodah zarah that becomes prohibited, like the grapes and the grain. But she'eno shonoi, if it's not something that brings cover to it, it's mutar. And we're going to ask in a second why bringing clothing to it doesn't make it nicer. But assuming it's something that doesn't make it beautiful, more beautiful.
Is it objectively nicer? Because some of the ways they worship idols were not
right. So
gross.
again, it's both, right? So correct. So 100%. If you're doing the thing that is the service of that avodah zarah, which could be very gross, that's always considered an avodah. Here we're talking about a general, more sort of, you brought a sacrifice, right? And you brought a gift, not a sacrifice, right? People bring anything. You bring your hair, you bring your car, you bring something. Is that considered to be a respectful thing or not a respectful thing? That's the criteria. And again, we're going to ask the question in a second, why clothing doesn't fit that criteria.
But respectful based on our understanding or based on what we know them to be?
So again, both respectful is based on our understanding, unless it's the specific worship method of worship of that avodah zarah, in which case you're prohibited.
Right, because we keep imposing our notions of halakha and avodah on them.
Correct. Meaning we use us as a template. We say anything that you don't do in the Beit HaMikdash, you can't do for them. So grapes,
is that the rabbi in the background coming in?
That is the rabbah in the background. Yes, Rabbi Claudia here. Ask the Gemara though, before we ask the question, Ema alehem dum yadi mahem. Why don't you go backwards? Why don't you say the other way, that the things on them are prohibited, similar to what's brought with them? Just like ma'i mahem, well, you would think kol mashi mahem. Anything you bring to worship an idol should be prohibited. So maybe af alehem means kol alehem. Right? Anything on top of them would be prohibited. Says, well, if that was the way to read it, imkain lo yemar alehem. So then what are you adding by saying alehem? If everything is in one category, right? Meaning that which you brought with them and that which you put on top of them, then you don't need two categories, right? So the fact that there's two categories means that there is a difference. So, and the difference is the following, that just like the only things you would bring for decorating an idol would be things that make it nicer. So, and that's prohibited if it makes it nicer. So too, things that you bring as a sacrifice or give as a gift, I shouldn't say sacrifice, things that you bring as a gift only become prohibited if they make it nicer. Ask the Gemara Ma'ot. Now, I don't get it. Why do you say money is not included? Davar shel noyu. Everyone loves money, right? Money's great. Says, well, no, it's not talking about a case where you used money or you gold plated or something like that. It's bekis kashur v'taloy lo b'tzavaro. It's where you basically use the idol to hold onto your pocketbook, right? You took your kiss, which means your money bag, and you hung it on the idol as like a hook, right? Meaning, which is a very disrespectful thing, right? You're not using it as a gift for it. You might be leaving it there, right? Put your money here and then go worship the god kind of thing, right? So it's really not a respectful thing. It's basically using the idol as holding onto your coat kind of thing. And that's the same question. What about ksut? Clothing seems like a very nice thing too. Davar shel noyu. You're giving it a nice scarf. Again, it's the same thing. It's biksut mikupelet umanachat la rosho. So you folded up your scarf and you put it on the head of the idol, for it to like be a placekeeper, to sell your wares in the store, on top of the idol. And the same question about kli. What about a vessel, right? A chair or thing, an object or a pot, davar shel noyu. It's also a nice thing. Rav Papa, dischifa le mashkilta aresha. It's where you put a mashkilta. So mashkilta is like a pot upside down on the head of the idol. So, I don't know, you need a place to dry your pot or something and you put on top of the idol. But either way, it was done very disrespectfully, and therefore it's not considered to be something done for nice things for the idol, and it doesn't become prohibited. Now says Rav Asi Amar Rabbi Chia, where am I? Amar Rav Asi Amar Bar Chia, sorry. Amar Rav Asi Bar Chia. Rav Asi, the son of Chia, said, Kol shehu lifnim min kilkalin. Anything that's inside of kilkalim, Rashi understands kilkalim is really the word klaim, which means, inner boundary, but we're saying it in a negative way. Kilkal means it's a destructive kind of thing. So it's basically like just a derogatory term. But anything that's within the inner sanctum of the avodah zarah, afilu mayim melech asur, even if it's water and salt, meaning it's things that are not very special, are prohibited because presumably they were brought for the idol. But if it's chutz l'kilkalin, if it's outside the inner sanctum, then davar shel noi asur. If it's something that enhances the beauty of it, it's asur. She'eno shel noi mutar, but if not, it's permitted. Amar Reb Yossi Bar Chanina, now Reb Yossi Bar Chanina said, Naktinan, we have a tradition that ein kilkalin lo lepor v'lo lemerkulis. That when you talk about the specific idols of Peor, where they used to denigrate themselves and go to the bathroom in front of it, or Merkulis, which is one we discussed where they threw stones to it, there's no concept of these inner sanctums. that noise? Oh, outside. Ask more Lamai. Now, what do you mean that there's no inner sanctum? Ilema, what do you mean to say that? That even things inside the inner sanctum of Pa'or and Markulis are like outside and they're permitted. How could you say that? Hashta Pa'uri Mifa'arin Kameh, right? You as James was asking, right? You worship this God by going to the bathroom, by defecating in front of it. So clearly it's not about respect. Right? So you're saying, oh, but it's not a nice enough gift to bring water. Water seems like a great gift for this God. Wash it down, right? What they were saying is that no, in those idols, even things that are outside the partitions, you have to assume were brought as a gift and become asur. So this whole concept that if it's outside or inside makes a difference is only in sort of normally worshipped idols, but in ones that you worship with methods of bizayon, it doesn't apply. So now we're up to the next Mishnah, around 2/3 of the way down. Says the Mishnah, Avodat kochavim shayila gina. Very common scenario, right? There's a temple, an idol, and they build a beautiful garden around that idol, and you want to go and enjoy this beautiful garden, right? Or the other very common thing, I think, was Omer Chatz, right? They had a bathhouse associated, so the church. I use church, but church, may or may not be Avodah Zarah, probably isn't, right? But the temple, let's say, built a beautiful bathhouse, and you could come to the temple and go to the bathhouse or the soup kitchen, or very, very common thing. The question is, can you get benefit from those things? Well, you're not worshiping the idol, but you are going and participating. So says the Mishnah, Ne'anin mehem, you can no problem to go enjoy the garden or the bathhouse, shelo b'tova. As long as you don't give anything to the idol, I mean, you don't pay money. We'll see in the Gemara who you're paying money to, but you don't pay money to the idol. But you cannot get benefit from them if there's a payment involved that benefits the idol. Now, let's say the bathhouse is owned by the church and by other people, right? It's a joint venture. Then you can pay money because we'll see in the Gemara why, but it's even though it's partly owned by church, it's also partly owned by others. Now, finally, says the Mishnah, and this is halacha we're going to get to very great detail today. Avodah Zarah shel oved kochavim, an Avodah Zarah made by a non-Jew, asura miyad. It's prohibited the minute it's made, even before it's worshipped. But shel Yisrael, if it's an Avodah Zarah of a Jew, ein asura achete aved, it only becomes prohibited when the Jew worships the idol. We've discussed this a lot before, and we're going to get into it in a lot of detail today. But before we get to that detail, says Abaya, Amar Abaya, when we say b'tova, tova means, right, b'tovat komarim. You're giving a benefit, you're paying money to the priests who work for the idol, basically. And shelo b'tova means shelo b'tovat komarim, that you're not paying the priest, la'afuki tovat ovdeha deshari. It's not a problem if you're giving tova, if you're giving money to those who worship the idol, right? Meaning, let's say there are people who are worshipers who open a store in front of the idol, you can buy things from them. The problem is you can't give money directly to the church or to the idol and the people who work for the idol themselves. So that's what Abaya clarified. Says Gemara, well, Ika dematin la seifa, but nothing. Gemara says some people had this comment of Abaya on the second part of the Mishnah, because the Mishnah continued now, quote, if the bathhouse or the gardens were owned by the idol and by others, then nehenim mehem b'tova shlo b'tova. Right? Then you can benefit from them whether you're paying money or not paying money. And that's where Abaya said, Amar Abaya, b'tova means if you're paying money, b'tovat achirim, you're paying the other people, as long as you don't pay the priests. But shelo b'tova means shelo b'tovat komarim, that you can't pay the priest, meaning that according to the second language, it would actually be prohibited to pay money in a joint venture if some of that money went to the priests. So in the first version, it would be okay, and the second version, it would be prohibited. Now, man de matinila seifa, the one who said this about the second part of the Mishnah, kol sheken hareisha, for sure that would be prohibited in the reisha. Man de matinila reisha, but if you said it about the reisha, what Abaya was saying was that only in the reisha is it prohibited to give money to the priests. Aval aseifa, but in the second part where it's a joint venture, kivan deika acherim bahada, since there are other owners, afilu b'tovat komarim nami shaper dami, you can even give money that's ultimately going to go to the priests. But because it's not only going to the priests, you're not directly or only exclusively supporting the idol, and therefore they didn't make a gzera, and it's okay in that case. So this, of course, would be very, very relevant in times where the bathhouses were run by the churches or by the gods, which I think in Rome at least seems like it was very common. At least they definitely had the shape, the figures of the gods always on the bathhouse. Anyways, continues the Gemara now to the new halacha. We're at the 2 dots around 10 lines from the bottom. Avodah Zarah shel nachri, shel avei kochavim, sorry. If you have an idol that's owned or made by a non-Jew, asura miyat, right? That's what our Mishnah said. Matnitzim mani. Now, who is the Tana of our Mishnah? It's Rabbi Akiva. The Tanya. Now, we're about to have a very lengthy braita, well, the rest of this Amud at least, that will go through this big machloka between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael about this concept. So it says the braita, the Tanya. Abed tabdun kol mekomot she'avdu sham hagoyim. You should wipe out and destroy all the places that were worshipped by the non-Jews, by the Avodah Zarah. Says the braita, that's referring to b'kelim shenishtamshu b'hem avodah zarah katuv medaber. It's referring to objects that were used to worship gods. Okay, not the avodah zarah itself, and not the place. Even though the pasuk says mikomot, we're going to ask that question in a second. But it's referring to the objects that were used for worship. Now, yachol meaning the objects that were turned into avodah zarah, right? Yachol asaum v'lo gamrum. You might think that if it was made for an idol, but not finished, meaning it wasn't, they used to take like pottery, you'd have to harden it and finish the process. So you shaped it, but didn't finish it. Or gamrum, you finished it, but you never actually brought it to be part of the function of the idol. Or Heviyum, you actually brought it, but they never used it. Yachol Yehu Asurim, you might think that these things are asur. Tamulomer asher avdu sham hagoyim. The goyim worshipped with them, meaning she'ein asurin ad sheyavdu. They only become prohibited when you actually do the avodah. Mikan amru, from here they said, avodah zarah shel ovei kochavim eino asura ad shete aved, which is not like our mission, just to be clear. Avodah zarah of a non-Jew only becomes prohibited when you worship it, but shel Yisrael asura miyat. If it's a Jew who made it, it's asur right away. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva says, I disagree, the opposite, chiluf hadvarim. It's the exact opposite, which is our Mishnah. Avodah zarah shel ovei kochavim is asura miyad. If it's made by a non-Jew, it's asur right away. And if it's made by a Jew, shel Yisrael ad shetei aved, until you worship it. So that's the braita, the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Our Mishnah is clearly going like Rabbi Akiva. Says the Gemara now at the bottom line of Daf Nun Aleph Amud Bet. Are we bottom line? Third to bottom line. Last 3 words on the line. Amar Mar. Let's try to understand this braita, right? So the braita says that, again, the first opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, B'kelim shenishtamshu ben avodah zarah katuv medaber. This pasuk, which says abed tabedun, destroy these things, is referring to destroy the objects that were made for avodah zarah. But it says mikomot. Ha-mikomot ktiv. It says destroy the places. So what do you mean destroy the kelim? It says destroy the places. It says, well, but it can't mean that. Because we understand, we learned last Shabbos' daf, I think, right, or Sunday, was that the places don't become asur. Tichtiv Elohehem al harim. The idols are on the mountains, but the mountains, even if they worship them, do not become prohibited. Lo harim Elohehem. So clearly the Torah is not saying destroy the places that they worshipped. It's referring to the objects that they worship. So Taneo in the Kelim, top words of Nun Bet Amud Aleph. So it must be referring to the objects. So from here they said, this is Rabbi Yishmael, Avodah zarah shel ovei kochavim eino asur ad shetei aved, and shel Yisrael miyad. Somewhere, slow down. How could you say that's referring to the idol? Habikelim ukim nilei. You just said it's referring to the objects that they brought to it, not the idol itself, not the statue. Says Gemara, you're right, but Amarkra, the pasuk continues in this same pasuk. This is the same verse or the same parsha. It continues and says, Asher atem yorshim otam et Elohehem, right? The thing which you are yoresh, the area of their gods, meaning yoresh, the area of Eretz Yisrael that has their gods. And because it mentions the object, which we said is the kelim, and it mentions the gods, makish Elohehem le kelim. We compare, so hekish is when you have things that are juxtaposed and you learn one from the other, or one is similar to the other. We compare the gods, meaning the idols, to the objects brought to the idol. Ma kelim achi yavdu, she'avdu. Just like kelim, we learn from this pasuk, you have to worship it for it to become prohibited, or use it for worship. The same thing would be true about the actual idol itself. It only becomes prohibited once you worship it. That is Rabbi Yishmael's opinion. And Rabbi Akiva says, well, that's not a big problem for me because lo makish, I don't have this hekesh. Amarlecha, he would say to you, et hifsika inyan. The word et is basically a pause. And so therefore, because it says the word et, you don't have to compare the objects to the idols. Okay, so that's why he is not bothered by the hekesh. Now, back to Rabbi Yishmael. It says Rabbi Yishmael, right, 8 lines from the top. So he just, which part?
Well, Rabbi Akiva is usually not the literalist, right? Like he's a literalist. He's the one who drashens every.
Yeah, but that's why et means something to it. I mean, because et is so, because et is extra, basically, it separates from Elohim to it is that. Mm-hmm. Now, so it says we just established, just to go back, because this is a very complicated brayta, from the pasuk of Abed Tabedun et Kol HaMikomot Asher Avdu, that you should destroy all of the mikomot, which we said means all of the objects that they worshipped. So what you see, and then we said the objects are comparable to the idols, right? So Ashkechan says, now we've discovered Avodah Zarah shel Avei Kochavim, the idol of a non-Jew, Ein Asura Chitei Avei. Okay, that we just established, according to Rabbi Yishmael. But the Yisrael, the Asura Miyad Minole, right? The Mishnah said there's one rule for Avodah Kochavim and then one rule for Jews. How do you know that a Jew is different? That it's Asur immediately. Says Gemara, it's just logical. There's no pasuk. The fact that Torah came and said to you one fact by a non-Jew implies that it's a different fact by the Jew. The Yisrael Asur Miyad, because the non-Jew is after they worship it. By the Jew, it would be immediate. Okay, so that's the svara. Ask the Gemara, Ema di Yisrael klal klalo. Maybe you're right that a non-Jew is prohibited once he worships it, but a Yisrael never becomes prohibited. Of course it becomes prohibited. We're going to show actually in a little bit, but we've had this before. You actually have to destroy it and bury it and get rid of it. You can't just stop worshiping it. You actually have to bury it underground. It's lo mitzar. You don't think it becomes prohibited? So it must be prohibited. Ask me, well, maybe ema kinachri. How do you know that it's so different? Sorry. Maybe the rule is the same for Yisrael and Ovei Kochavim, that it only becomes prohibited when you worship it. Amar Kra says, Gemara, there's another pasuk. And this pasuk in a totally different context in this week's parsha, it says when Moshe talks about coming up, Ekev, that chatatchem asher asitem et ha'egel, you made the egel. Now, what's the sin of making the egel? The sin should be worshiping the egel. Well, you see from here, mishat asiya kamle bechet, that just making the egel is the beginning, and it already becomes an idol and is prohibited at that time. Says, well, 1 second. Maybe it's telling you that it's a bad thing to make an egel, right? And the person who makes it is over an avera. But it's la mitzar. How do you know the object becomes asur before it's worshipped? Amarkra, the pasuk says, and this is a much later pasuk, right? In the Tochacha, arur ha'ish asher yaseh pesel masecha. It says someone is cursed who makes a pesel, not who worships a pesel, who makes a pesel. Mishat asiyah kamle ba'arur. You see that from the moment of making it, you already get cursed. Again, the same question. Maybe that's the personal responsibility, that a person's cursed for making it, but itzurei lo mitzara. Maybe the object does not become asur just because you made it. Says well, the pasuk then continues later in Tochacha and says tovat Hashem. It is a to'eva to Hashem. Something that's a to'eva to Hashem becomes prohibited. Rabbi Akiva says it doesn't mean that it's a to'eva. It means davar mevi lidei to'eva. It's an object that will bleed to abomination if a person worships it. But it doesn't mean that it's a to'eva. So that is the machloket. Rabbi Yishmael understands from the pasuk of ultimately to'eva that a Yisrael who makes an idol is over a prohibition. It's a to'eva and therefore it's prohibited. Rabbi Akiva says no big deal. Not no big deal, I guess, but it's not prohibited. So that is Rabbi Yishmael's opinion, that once a non-Jew makes it, it only becomes prohibited when they worship it. If a Jew makes it, it becomes prohibited right away. Ask him, what about Rabbi Akiva, the author of our Mishnah? Rabbi Akiva, the last of the narrow lines on Bet Amud Aleph, Avodat kochavim shalvei kochavim desur miyad minale. How does Rabbi Akiva hold the opposite opinion, that an idol of a non-Jew becomes prohibited right away? Amar Ula, Amar Kruk, because the pasuk says, Psilei Elohim tisrafun be'esh. right? This was today's parsha. The psilei Elohehem, the idols. Now it's a funny word to use psilei, and we use psilei. Psilei means the image, but also means the act of making the image, right? Pasel is the act. What's the word? Lifsol, right? So is the word of making. So it can be a verb and a noun. But psilei Elohim teaches you mishepislo, from the moment you function, you craft it, not form it, naseh Eloha. It becomes an idol and is prohibited, made by a non-Jew. So what does Rabbi Shmuel say with that? Hahumi Baile Tani Rabbi Yosef. He says that pasuk is completely used for something else, like Tani Rav Yosef. The Tani Rav Yosef. Now, of course, remember it's always interesting when we do this because obviously Rav Yosef would live much after Rabbi Shmuel. So Rabbi Shmuel did not, hold off on the pasuk for Rav Yosef to come. It's that Rav Yosef elaborated on what Rabbi Shmuel was thinking, right? The Tani Rav Yosef, as Rav Yosef taught, Minayin lovei kochavim sheposel Eloha. Right, this halacha that we had before, we're going to have tomorrow actually a lot, that you can actually nullify an avodah zarah. You can cancel it. You can make an idol and say, I changed my mind, and then it becomes permitted. How do you know that? Shenemar, because we use the word psilei, which also sounds like crafting, but it sounds like canceling, right? Pasal. So psilei Elohim tisrufum be'esh. So how does Rabbi Akiva know that? Nafkali mi Shmuel. The Shmuel Rami, again, Shmuel much later. Shmuel asked a contradiction. It says in the pasuk, lo tachmon kesef v'zahav aleihem. Right? It says, don't desire, don't covet the silver and the gold on the idols. So don't take it. But then it says later, you can take it for yourself. So what does that mean? When can you take the gold and when can't you take the gold? Haketzad, says Shmuel, pislo le'eloha. If they made it into a god, right, then lo tachmod, then you can't take it and you can't desire it. But paslo mei Eloha, if they canceled it from being a god, meaning they were posel it, then lekachta lecha. So you learn from that pasuk that sometimes you can take things, sometimes you can't, because an idol can be canceled. So that is Rabbi Akiva's source. I'm not sure what Rabbi Shmuel does with it, but that's Rabbi Akiva's source. Says we're okay, great. Step one. Rabbi Akiva, we got step one. Ashkechan. Where are we? Sixth wide line. You found avodat kochavim shalvei kochavim da'asur miyad. We found that the moment you make an avodah zarah, your posel, your psilei, you craft, you fashion a idol, it becomes prohibited. But the Yisrael achetei aved minalan. How do you know that a idol made by a Jew does not become asur until it's worshipped? Rav Yehuda Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, again, this is going way back to the tochacha that we discussed before. It says you take the gods, the sum beseter, and you set it up in a hiding place, right? Meaning, until you do what you do in private, which is worship it. So until you do the worship, it doesn't become prohibited. What does Rabbi Yishmael do with the pasuk of the sum beseter? This is what we referenced earlier. How do you know that an idol made by a Jew needs to be buried to get rid of it, meaning to destroy any connection to it? Shenemar v'sam beseter, because it says you should place it in a hiding thing, which does not mean you should worship it in a hidden place. You should place it in a hidden place once you get rid of it. What does Rabbi Akiva do with that? How does he know that you have to hide it? He learns it from Chisda Marav, Damar Chisda Marav, Minayin Avodah Kochavim Shel Yisrael, Shetu'una Geniza. How do you know that Avodah Zarah of a Jew has to be hidden when you cancel it? Shenemar, because the pasuk says, this is a pasuk coming up actually in Shoftim, right? Again, it's all coming up, right? Lo tita lecha ashera kol eitz eitzel mizbeach. Don't plant an ashera. Remember that ashera tree we talked about a lot last week, which is a tree built for avodah zarah. Don't plant that next to the altar. Now, what's the connection, right? Now, of course, they did that a lot, but it's prohibited wherever you put it. But the limit of the pasuk is just like an altar, which is kodesh, right? And when it's used for when it's destroyed, etc. We'll see actually a case in a minute. You have to bury it because it's hekdesh. Af ashera tu'una geniza. So too, an ashera needs to be hidden when it is being destroyed. It's not enough just to cancel it. The Irach, and what does again Rabbi Shmuel do with that pasuk? He uses Reish Lakish again many generations later. Anyone who appoints a judge who is not appropriate, It's as if you planted an idol. Shenemar, because if you look at the psukim, right, it says in the beginning of Shoftim, it says Shoftim v'shotrim titein lecha b'chol sha'arecha, appoint judges. B'samichle, and then 2 psukim later it says Lo tita lecha asher kol eitz. What's the connection? The connection is that if you don't do the right thing and appoint the right judges, it's as if you appointed an idol. And says Rav Ashi, it's even worse than that. Makom talmidei chachamim, if it's a place where there's actually righteous people, so there are good alternative judges, then it's gilon nato eitzom mizbeach. It's not only like you made an idol, it's like you made an idol next to the altar, because the talmidei chachamim are like the altar. Shenemar eitzom mizbeach, right? Okay. Anyway, so that is the end of this long exposition. It's not really the end, but it's the end of the beginning of this long exposition of the machloket of Rabbi Yishmael, who says that if you make an idol, if it's for a non-Jew, it's asur after they worship it, and for a Jew, miyad. And Rabbi Akiva, the opinion of our Mishnah, that's the opposite. That if it's for a non-Jew, it's prohibited immediately, and if it's for a Jew, it's only prohibited once you worship it. By a Jew, correct. Did I say something different? Oh yeah, by a Jew. Right. Where are we up to? So now we ask a new question. By Rav Hamnuna, it's around 20 lines from the bottom. Ask Rav Hamnuna a very interesting question. We'll see how it's connected, of course. Ritech kli avodah zarah. If you ritech, Rashi says ritech means, here it says welded. I have an English in front of me, but you basically reconstructed a vessel for avodah zarah. So meaning you had a vessel, let's just say it had a hole in it, it was ruined, and you refashioned it in purpose of using it for avodah zarah. Sumahu. Does that become prohibited at the moment that you crafted this new kli? Says more 1 second. Avodah zarah deman. No, again, is it a Jew or a non-Jew? Ileim avodah zarah de ovei kochavim. So then, right, it doesn't matter. Bein the Rabbi Yishmael, bein the Rabbi Akiva, whether you're going to Rabbi Yishmael or Rabbi Akiva, about whether the idol is prohibited when you worship it or not, this is not the idol. This is mishamshei avodah zarah. This is the pot, that you're using to serve things for the avodah zarah. U'mishamshei avodah zarah, everybody agrees, eino asurin ad sheyavdu. They only become prohibited when you actually worship it. It's only a machloket about the idol itself, but not about the pots you're using for the idol. Ella, the question must be avodah zarah di Yisrael. Okay, you're making this pot for the worship of an idol that's owned by a Jew. Okay, now aliba deman. So now, who's the question going according to? Ilem aliba Rabbi Akiva. If you're asking according to Rabbi Akiva, remember Rabbi Akiva said that the idol itself is not prohibited when you make it until you worship it. Hashtahi gufa lo mitzvah shetei. The idol itself is not prohibited until you worship it. Misham shem boy. If there's no question about the pots, they're for sure not prohibited when you make it. Ella aliba de Rabbi Yishmael. It's going according to Rabbi Yishmael, who says that if you make an idol for a Jew by a Jew, it's prohibited right away. What about if you make a pot for the idol? Is it prohibited right away or only prohibited when you worship with the pot? Rabbi Yishmael said asur miyad. What about mishamshin? My mishamshin. What about things that you use to worship the avodah zarah? Mi mishamshin gamrina. Do you say that you learn it out from mashin gamrina? Sorry, is the way to read it. Do you learn it out from the idol itself? Right? Ma hadam mi mashin gamrina. Right?
This min shamshin.
Mishamshim. Sorry, you're right. That's an extra mem. I missed the mem. Do you say mishamshim of a Jewish idol or learned out mishamshim of a non-Jewish, right? Mishamshim gamrina. Ma hatam, just like by a non-Jewish idol, or an idol, no idols are Jewish, right? A non-Jew worshiping an idol, everyone said it's permitted ad sheyavdu until they actually worship with it. Avhacha, so by a Jew, ad sheyavdu. Odilma minagamer, or do you learn it from an internal thing, meaning just like by a Jew who's worshiping an idol, the idol becomes asur as soon as he makes it. Mahi asura miyad, af mishamsheh asurin miyad. So that's the question. Okay, so that was an interesting question of Rav Hamnuna. We don't actually have an answer right away. Before we get to answer the question, the Gemara says, slow down. None of this makes any sense, because if this was Rav Hamnuna's question, what Rav Hamnuna should have just said is, if you go and you buy a pan and you bring it to the idol, is it prohibited or not prohibited? Right? He asked a weird question of ritech, where you welded together a broken kli to make it a new kli. Why would you pick that case and not a regular case where you go to IKEA and you buy a regular pot? Right? Why did he pick a case of rewelding a kli? Says Gemara, my ear coming by like we take kli, right? Tibaile asay. Ask a question where you asa, where you make a kli. Like why this unusual case where you recrafted a broken kli? Says Gemara, the whole thing, Rav Hamnuna's question had nothing to do with Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Hamnuna was asking for a whole nother reason. Mishum Tumah Yishana Kami Boile. He was asking me about the question of what's called Tumah Yishana, which means old Tumah. Meaning, there's a concept, a huge concept in Kelim, where you have an object, it's tameh. If that object becomes pasul from becoming a kli, meaning it's broken, it's no longer tameh. If you refashion that kli, the question is, does it become tameh again? So here, you had an object that was used for Avodah Zarah. It was prohibited, right? It was tameh, because we'll see in a second. There's tumah in Avodah Zarah. It broke. And once it broke, it's no longer tameh. Then you refashioned it for the Avodah Zarah. Does it regain its tumah before you worship it? It's not. And this is based on the Mishnah in Kalim, which says the following. Kli matachot. You have a object that's made out of metal. Pshutehen umikableim tmeim. The pshutim, meaning the flat part of it, and the mikabel, the inner part, the beit kibul, are liable to become tameh. Nishtabru, if they become broken, taharu, then they become tahar. But if you're chazar v'asan kelim, if you refashion them, then yachzur l'tumah yishana. They go back to their original tumah, right? So if you take a silver goblet, right, and it's tameh mate, and then you break it, it's no longer tameh. But if you refashion it into a cup, it regains the old tumah. And the question Rav Hamnuna was asking was, what about Avodah Zarah? This was the question here by Avodah Zarah. Where am I? Ki hadra tumah. When we say the tumah goes back, is that hani mila tumah doraita? Is that for tumah that's from the Torah, like tumah mate or zav or things like that? Of a tumah d'Rabbanan, but tumah of an Avodah Zarah is only, it's a gzer d'Rabbanan. So low, maybe it doesn't apply in this case. Or maybe there's no difference. So okay, that's a good question, but why didn't he ask about every tumah d'Rabbanan, right? There's plenty of tumah d'Rabbanan, keri and zi, whatever, many things. Tibayle shar tumah d'Rabbanan. Says, well, no, chadamigo. He was asking one question within another question, meaning he was asking a layered question. Meaning, first of all, his first question was Tumad Rabbanan mihadra lo hadra. Does Tumad Rabbanan regain its life if the object is refashioned or not? And im tim slomer lo hadra, if you say it doesn't, what about if it's Avodah Zarah? Tumad Avodah Zarah, which is D'Rabbanan, but it's mishum chumra Avodah Zarah, mishav Rabbanan ketumad doraita olo, right? It might be different by Avodah Zarah than every other Tumah D'Rabbanan because it's much stricter. Teiko, and we don't have a resolution to that question.
It's Tumah, so we have to bring it back.
But it has nothing to do with the question of Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva, which we originally thought. Says the Gemara, and we're not done with it, don't worry. Rabbi Yochanan, 4 lines from the bottom. Rabbi Yochanan asked Rabbi Yanai the following question. Takrovet Avodah Zarah shel ochlim. Let's say you have an offering of Avodah Zarah that's food. Someone brings a beautiful, delicious meal to Avodah Zarah, right? Mahu. Now, what's the halacha if it's canceled? Remember, you can cancel an Avodah Zarah, right? Can you cancel the takrovet? The answer is you can't. We'll see in a second. Meaning, you can't eat this burger because the guy said, I no longer want to worship this God. I want to have a barbecue, right? But the question is, does it lose its tumah? Will it lose its status of tumah? Let's say you touch it and you're makbid on tumah, olo, or not. Says Gemara that Rabbi Yochanan asked this question to Rabbi Yanai. Ask the Gemara, why did Rabbi Yochanan ask the question about food? Tibayle kelim. Why did he ask it about, meaning why did he specifically ask food? Why did he ask it about a pot? You bring a pot to the Avodah Zarah, you cancel it. Is it lose its tumah? Says Gemara, well, kelim lo kami baile. He didn't ask a question about kelim because kelim itle tara b'mikvah. Remember, there's other ways to be mitara kli. A kli that becomes tameh, any tumah really, even tumah mate, there's a way to be mitaheret in a mikvah. So tumah nami batla, clearly you can get rid of the tumah of a kli. But ki kami baile ochlim, but remember, food never loses its tumah. You cannot put your food in a mikvah, just in case you're trying that at home, right? So food does not lose its tumah. So the question is, can you cancel tumah on a food by canceling the Avodah Zarah? Asking where that's the sacrifice. What about the Avodah Zarah itself? Does it lose its tumah when it's canceled? Says more, well, Avodah Zarah gufa lo kami baile, turn the page, because kivan di isura batil, tuma nami bitala. Remember, Avodah Zarah, you can actually cancel an Avodah Zarah. It's going to be tomorrow's Mishnah, and we've discussed it before, that if you break off the nose, let's say, the Avodah Zarah is no longer worshipped, you can do it for anything. So the tuma goes away. What about if you brought a sacrifice to Avodah Zarah? Remember that the food never becomes permitted. If you recall, we had 3 days ago on Daf Nun, and we're going to have it in a minute, the words of Rav Gidol, who said that, remember, bringing a sacrifice to an Avodah Zarah is called zivchei metim. It's called bringing it to the dead. And just like dead it's hard to uncancel death, right? You can't uncancel Avodah Zarah. Tuma nami lo batla. So maybe the Tuma never gets canceled. Odilma, maybe that's only true about the Hana. Isur d'oraita lo batil, meaning the fact that you're not allowed to eat it. But Tuma d'Rabbanan, batil and teku. We don't have an answer to that question. Now, one final, we got people still paying attention? We're good here? Okay, we 5 more minutes, we'll get to the Mishnah, and then we'll be all caught up. But we have a fascinating halacha here. We are 6 lines from the top. So there was an interesting, Rashi goes through this a little bit here. If you recall, it's a Mishnah in Masechet Menachot, and a long discussion, which we'll get to in around a year or so. So there was a very interesting historical event, which I think we have some record of, in the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, when there was a great Kohen Gadol called Shimon HaTzadik, or Simon the Just, as they called him, who, like many people, had many children. And his children fought about who would take over. And one of his children's name was Chonyo, is how we pronounce it. I'm not sure if there's a Greek name or whatever. And he got the short stick. His brothers kicked him out of the house. And he went to, this is all in the Mishnah in Menachot. He went to Egypt, where I guess there was a Jewish community. Again, this was all, in Alexandria. And he built a temple in Alexandria. I don't know if it was in Alexandria, but somewhere in Egypt. And he worshipped in that temple, and it was called Beit Chonyo, Chonyo's temple, right? And there's a machloket in the Mishnah in Menachot whether he built it for Hashem, right? He was like like when the Hasidic Rebbe dies, and one child goes and becomes a Rebbe in the next town. So he didn't have a home in Jerusalem anymore, so he went to Egypt. And one says he did it for Avodah Zarah. So that is, again, I don't know historically how much records we have of this, but the Gemara talks about it a lot in Menachot. There's a whole discussion about it. So anyways, ask the Gemara today, just to give you a little bit of something to keep us awake at 10:30. Rabbi Yossi ben Shaul Rabbi Yossi ben Shaul asked Rabbi, Kalim sheshimshu b'hem bebeit chonyo, ma'o shishtamshu b'hem bebeit hamikdash. Right? Let's say Beit Chonyo is having a yard sale, right? So they're going out of business. So all of the vessels, the pots, the knives, the tables that they use in Beit Chonyo, can you use them in the Beit HaMikdash in Israel, in Jerusalem, assuming that there was a Beit HaMikdash? This question, comes up all the time when I went to a shul growing up where they bought the pews from a church. And I know this because they had to put like a little sticker on the side where the cross was, right? And as kids, we always tried to peel it off. But so this is almost identical question. Obviously, a pew is not the same as an object that you worship with. But can you take an object from Beit Chonyo and use it in the Beit HaMikdash? Okay, so that was the question he asked. Right? Obviously, he's asking him, according to the Manda Amar, that Beit Chonyo was not done for worship. Because if it was done for worship, it would for sure be prohibited. It's not. And this now, we quote the Mishnah in Menachot. The Mishnah says, Kohanim sheshimshu Beit Chonyo, the priests who worked in Beit Chonyo, they are blacklisted. Lo yishamshu b'mikdash Yerushalayim. They definitely cannot work in Yerushalayim, in the Beit HaMikdash. Ve'eno tzarech lomer davar acher. Certainly if they were worshipped other things, meaning if they worshipped idols, and that's how we know Beit Chonyo is not an idol, right? They cannot work in Yerushalayim. Now the question that Rabbi Yossi ben Shaul asked Rebbe was, is it Kohanim who dekansu Rabbanan? The priests got a knas because they should know better. Mishum de b'nei deyaninu. Avol kelim, but objects, right? The pots did not choose to be worshipped. Odilma loshna, or is there no difference? So Amar lo, so Rebbe said back to Rabbi Yossi ben Shaul, asurin heim. It's prohibited. And I know it's prohibited, but I can't remember why. I had it based on a pasuk, and I have no recollection of the pasuk, but I am confident that I once knew this, and it was prohibited, and I just can't remember why. So Eitve. So Yossi ben Shaul asked, what about the following pasuk in Divrei Yamim, which is really right around where we're up to right now in Divrei Yamim. It says, by Achaz. It says, remember, Achaz unfortunately worshipped Avodah Zarah and brought all kinds of idols into the temple. And when Achaz died, and his, I think, grandson or descendant, Chizkiyahu came, it's not his grandson, it was much later, came, he said the following, I think it was Chizkiyahu. He said, Kol hakelim asher hazniach hamelech Achaz b'malchuto, all of the objects that Achaz used to worship idols, that hazniach means he cast away, b'ma'alo, that he rebelled against Hashem, heichenu, they prepared them, hikdishanu, and they made them kodesh. So what that seems to sound like is they took the kelim of Avodah Zarah and of heichenu, that's bolinu, they prepared them by putting them in a mikvah, and hikdishanu, and then they used them for the Beit HaMikdash, dakdishinu. They put Shema HaMishcha on them to make them kodesh. So you see, you can reuse the kelim. Amarlo, so Rebbe said to him, thank you so much. Baruch atah l'shamayim, shechzarta li'avedati. Blessed are you to God, to heavens, that you returned my lost object. Because this was my pasuk, and I learned the exact opposite thing from you, from the pasuk. Heichanu means they shiganzum, they buried them. I mean, they destroyed them. Hikdishanu, and they made new ones. Hikdishu acherim tachtehem. That it means they had to get rid of the kelim that were used, and they can never use them again. And lema misayele, let's prove this from a Mishnah in Midot, which we're going to have very shortly. The Mishnah says, I'm sorry, not so shortly. The Mishnah says in Midot, Mizrachit Tzfonit, in the northeast corner, right? Mizrachit Tzfonit, the northeast corner of the Azara, there was a chamber, where the Chashmonaim hid and buried the stones of the Mizbeach that were ruined, that were wrecked by the Greeks. The Greeks came and worshipped idols in the Mizbeach. When the Chashmonaim came and took it over, they had to destroy the Mizbeach and bury it. So what do you see from there? Amar Rav Sheshet. Rav Sheshet explained that they used the Mizbeach for Avodah Zarah, and therefore they had to destroy it. So you see from here that you're not allowed to use an object that was used for Avodah Zarah, even if the Avodah Zarah was canceled. Right? They destroyed the Greeks. They broke down their idols, but still you cannot rededicate it. Amar, if Papa said, well, that's not a proof, because the Mizbeach might be different. Hatam kra ashkach v'darsh. They found the pasuk in Yecheskel, stichtiv, uba paritzim v'chilalu, that the pritzim, the ones who broke down the gates, came in and desecrated it. So you see from that pasuk that the Mizbeach can be desecrated, and therefore you can't use it ever again. But you don't necessarily know what happens by the objects, the kelim. Now, Amri says the Gemara, getting back to the question of the Chashmonaim, right? They showed up on Hanukkah and they liberated the Beit HaMikdash from the Greeks, and they wanted to worship again. And they said, Hechi na'avi. The Gemara says we're having the inner dialogue of the Chashmonaim. What do we do with this Mizbeach? Nitzbarinu, should we break the Mizbeach and use the pieces? You can't use pieces. Remember, Avanim Shleimot Rachman. You got to use whole stones. So, okay, we can't do that. Ninasrinu, should we put it back together, right? Meaning break it and then put it back together with metal or whatever. Lo tanifalei barzel, Rachman. The Torah says you can't use barzel, right? You can't use iron on them. So amai. So it says, well, why don't we do the following? Litzbarinu, why don't you break the Mizbeach? You can't use it for the Mizbeach again, but lishkalinu nafshayo. Take it home and build a beautiful garden and a beautiful house. These are great big stones. Says, well, that can't be, because Midlo Amar Reb Oshaya, didn't Reb Oshaya say that after, this is the Gemara is referring to the time after the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, but Bikshu lignoz kol kesef ezav sheba'olam, they wanted to hide and sequester all of the silver and gold coinage in the world, mishum kaspa dedava shel Yerushalayim, because of the gold and silver of Jerusalem, meaning that most of the gold and silver in Jerusalem belonged to Hekdesh, right, and therefore was prohibited. When the temple was destroyed and all the money was taken captive, they figured most of the money in the world is now potentially from Hekdesh. So let's not use money again. We have to get new money. Says, what do you mean? Havina, but we asked, Yerushalayim haviruba da'alma, right? Is Jerusalem the most of the world? It's not likely that all the money comes from Jerusalem. El Amar Bai, what Bai says, no, they didn't want to get rid of all the money. Bikshu lignoz, they wanted to get rid of a specific coinage. Dinare Hadriana Turyana Shifa, which Claudia has a picture of. So these are dinarim, which had a picture of Hadrian and Turyana. I don't know who Turyana was, but I guess another Roman, sorry. It's Rashi's Trajan. Trajans, okay, that were Shifa. Shifa, Rashi understands, means coins that were very worn out, that were that were used up, basically. Mipnei tiv'ah shel Yerushalayim. They said because these coins, most of these coins came from Jerusalem, and many of them, of course, belong to the Hekdesh. And now we don't know which ones are, so let's stop using coins from that vintage. Ad shematzula mikra min Torah, but they found the pasuk. The pasuk said shu mutar because it says ubo ba pritzim b'chililu. The pritzim will come and knock it down and desecrate it, meaning it's no longer hektish. So once it's been profaned, you can use it because it no longer belongs to hektish. So, anyways, long story short, why, if they're allowed to use the coins, can't they use the stones in the mizbeach? So why did the Chashmonaim take the mizbeach and build houses? Answers the Gemara because Hatam, there by the coins, they belong to Hektish, but they weren't used. Lo ishtamshu b'legavo, they weren't used to serve God. Hacha by the Mizbeach, kivan de ishtamish lu legavoa, since they were literally used to worship Hashem, lav orachar l'ishtamish b'behedyota, it's not nice to go and make your house in your living room from the stones of the Mizbeach. So because of that, they couldn't use them, because you're not allowed to use them. They couldn't take them home and use them for their houses, so they buried them, and that was buried in the northeast corner of the Zarah, the stones of the Mizbeach, and of course they made a new Mizbeach for the rest of the duration of the Beit HaMikdash. And so
Aren't
we
you
got
able to transfer the hektish of coins to something else?
Say that again?
Aren't you able to transfer the hektish on coins?
You could, yes. I guess that would have been a solution. You could have been mevatel the money of any potential coin, but I guess then you might as well make new coins, right?
Yeah, just if ever you
Right.
came a coin of that printing of that denomination, you
So,
would
but
just,
you'd have to have an equivalent value. I guess the other concern is that the thing you changed it for now becomes hektish, and you got to worry about that getting used inappropriately.
what do we do now with hektish? Don't we?
Well, we hopefully don't have any hektish. I mean, I guess you should probably bury it, right?
It's not that same thing where it has to be the equivalent value. It's not like
Correct, right? It's not like true Misa, right? Misa you could do
Truma
other
mice, you can do it onto like a
small amount,
minuscule
yeah.
value. Got it.
Okay, we got up to the Mishnah. Thank you all for daf and a half, I'll say. We're learning tomorrow morning at 7:45 sharp. We'll try to finish as much as we can if Ken can join us, and if not, it'll be a recording. And so I'll see you all in a few hours. Hope. What did James share on Wikipedia? Ship of Theseus.
Oh, that's very interesting. Ship of Theseus is a quandary where the ship of Theseus was put in a museum, and over many years they had to replace all the parts. And the question is it still the ship of Theseus if all the parts have been replaced with new parts? It reminded me of the thing you were talking about with Tuma. If
Right.
if the kelim are broken and remade, is it the same kelim or is it not the same kelim?
Very nice. Very good example.
And Josephus's Beit Chonia was in the Egyptian city of Leontopolis. Leontopolis.
I've never been there.
Well, Leontopolis. I don't know.
Leontopolis, yeah.
Anyways, Beit Chonia, yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, we'll see much more about it in Menachot, but I'm sure there's a lot of historical things. It sounds like Josephus talks about it. And, just the idea of Jews building another center.
That story in Shkalim of the people who had the Torah recipe and they wouldn't share it. And there was some issue of this Egyptian temple that had the recipe too.
Right.
And they wouldn't share.
They wouldn't share. No, that we did have that as well. Correct.
That's
Yeah, I don't know if it's the same place or time. I don't know. Okay, Shavua Tov, everyone. We'll see you
Thank you.
tomorrow morning. Good night.